The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been my sanctuary, but now resembled a battlefield. Broken stems jutted from overturned soil like the bones of some ancient creature, and the sweet fragrance of crushed lavender mixed with the acrid smell of uprooted earth. My hands trembled as I knelt beside the remnants of my prize-winning heirloom tomatoes, their green fruit scattered across the pathway like abandoned marbles. 3 months of careful cultivation, of dawn waterings and evening prunings, of whispered encouragements to each seedling, all of it destroyed in what my Aunt Margaret claimed was just a bad storm. But I knew better. Storms don't selectively target only the most valuable plants. They don't leave the cheap marigolds untouched while decimating rare heritage roses. They don't create perfectly straight lines of destruction that stopped precisely at the property line I shared with my aunt's backyard. "Maya, honey, you're overreacting," Aunt Margaret had said the previous evening, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension I'd grown to recognize over the past year since moving back to Millbrook. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching me survey the damage with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly entertaining television program. "These spring storms can be vicious. Remember the one back in '98? Took down that old oak in the Hendersons' yard." But Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor to the east, had called me that morning with a different story. Her garden remained pristine, she'd reported, not so much as a petal disturbed, despite being directly in the path of what should have been the same destructive weather system. Her voice carried a weight of understanding when she spoke, the kind that comes from living in a small town for 73 years and knowing exactly how family dynamics can poison even the most innocent situations. "That child of hers has been acting out something fierce since the divorce finalized," Mrs. Henderson had whispered into the phone, though we both knew that child was my 22-year-old cousin Derek, who'd been living with his mother since losing his job at the auto parts store 6 months ago. "I've seen him wandering around at all hours, looking like he's got something eaten at him from the inside." The motion sensor camera had been Derek's suggestion, ironically enough. 2 weeks earlier, during what I'd naively believed was a pleasant family dinner, he'd mentioned how neighborhood kids have been causing trouble around town. "You should really think about getting some security for that garden of yours, Maya. All that hard work you're putting in would be a real shame if something happened to it." At the time, I'd interpreted his words as cousin-like concern. Derek and I had grown up together, spending summers catching fireflies and building elaborate fort systems in the woods behind our grandparents' house. He'd been the one to teach me how to whistle through my fingers and how to skip stones across Miller's Pond. But that was before life had hardened him, before his father left with the 25-year-old secretary and his mother began drinking her way through the evenings while pretending everything was fine. Now, standing in the ruins of my garden, I remembered the strange gleam in Derek's eyes when he'd made that suggestion about security cameras. The way he'd lingered by my gate after dinner, asking pointed questions about my watering schedule and whether I ever checked on the plants after dark. Questions that seemed innocent enough at the time, but now felt like reconnaissance. The small black device mounted discreetly among the climbing roses had been recording everything for the past 10 days. Its memory card contained 240 hours of footage, most of it showing nothing more than exciting than occasional rabbit or the methodical progress of my automatic sprinkler system. But somewhere in those digital files lay the truth about what happened during the night between Tuesday and Wednesday, when my garden had been transformed from a thriving testament to careful cultivation into this scene of calculated destruction. I'd installed the camera on a Saturday afternoon with help from Tom Kellerman, the hardware store owner who'd become something of a friend since my return to Millbrook. Tom was one of those rare individuals who listened more than he spoke, and his weathered hands worked with the precision of someone who'd spent decades solving practical problems for his neighbors. "You sure you need something this sophisticated?" he had asked, holding up the wireless camera with its motion detection and night vision capabilities. "Most folks around here just want to know if their petunias are being nibbled by deer." But I had insisted on the advanced model, driven by an intuition I couldn't quite name.
Growing up in Millbrook had taught me that small towns harbor big secrets, and that family loyalty could sometimes be the most dangerous delusion of all. My mother had learned that lesson the hard way when her own sister had systematically undermined her relationship with their parents, feeding them carefully crafted half-truths about mom's life choices until she'd found herself effectively exiled from family gatherings. History, I had discovered, has a way of rhyming. Tom had secured the camera with the thoroughness of a man who took pride in his work, running the wiring through a nearly invisible channel he'd carved into the wooden fence post. Motion activated, he had explained, but it'll also record continuously during the overnight hours, just in case someone's smart enough to move real slow. Battery backup, too, in case someone thinks to cut the power. His precautions had seemed excessive at the time. Now they felt prophetic. The garden had been my attempt at rebuilding something beautiful after the collapse of my marriage and the subsequent loss of the house David and I had shared in Portland. Moving back to my childhood hometown at 34 felt like admitting defeat, but my grandmother's cottage had been sitting empty since her death, and the inheritance provided both shelter and opportunity for a fresh start. The soil here held memories. As a child, I'd helped Grandma Rose tend to these same beds, learning the secret language of plants and seasons. She'd taught me to read the subtle signs that indicated when tomatoes were ready for transplanting, how to judge the perfect moment for pruning roses, and why certain herbs needed to be harvested under a full moon for maximum potency. Her hands had been like bark, rough and brown from years of coaxing life from the earth, but gentle enough to handle the most delicate seedlings. Plants know when you care about them, she used to say, and they respond accordingly. But they also know when someone wishes them harm. I'd dismiss that as the gentle mysticism of an old woman who'd spent too much time alone with her thoughts. But standing among the wreckage of my carefully planned garden, Grandma Rose's words carried a different weight. The destruction I was surveying wasn't random. Someone had moved through my garden with intimate knowledge of what would hurt me most. The heritage rosebush that had taken me 6 weeks to locate from a specialty grower in California lay in pieces, its root system exposed and systematically severed. The raised bed containing my collection of heirloom vegetables, seeds I'd obtained through a trading network of dedicated gardeners, had been emptied of soil, the plants scattered with their roots pointing skyward like accusations against the pale morning sky. But the cherry tomato plants remained untouched. So did the row of common zinnias I'd planted along the front border. The invader had known enough about gardening to distinguish between the valuable and the replaceable, targeting only those plants that had required significant investment of time, money, or emotional energy. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the fence line, her silver hair pinned back in the practical style she'd worn for as long as I'd known her. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee and the expression of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to deliver uncomfortable news. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to be the one to tell you this," she said, handing me one of the mugs, "but I saw Derek's truck parked down on Maple Street around 2 in the morning Wednesday. Thought it was strange, and being out so late when he usually turns in early these days."
The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, prepared in the old-fashioned way that small-town residents still favored despite the invasion of fancy coffee shops in the county seat. I wrapped my hands around the mug, grateful for both the warmth and the gesture of solidarity it represented. He was probably just visiting friends, I heard myself say, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Derek's social circle had shrunk considerably since the divorce proceedings began, when most of his high school buddies had chosen sides or simply drifted away rather than deal with the family drama. Mrs. Henderson gave me a look that managed to be both sympathetic and skeptical. "Honey, I've been watching this neighborhood longer than you've been alive. I know the difference between a social call and someone trying not to be seen. That boy parked 3 blocks away from where he was going and walked the rest of the way. That's not the behavior of someone making an innocent visit." A red-winged blackbird landed on the remains of my bean trellis, cocking its head as if examining the damage with professional interest. The sight of it triggered a memory from childhood. Derek and me, maybe 8 and 10 years old,
building elaborate scarecrows to protect Grandma's vegetable garden. We'd competed to see who could create the most effective deterrent, stuffing old clothes with newspaper and positioning them strategically throughout the beds. Birds are honest, Derek had said then, adjusting the angle of his scarecrow's hat. They don't pretend to be something they're not. They either want your seeds or they don't. The irony wasn't lost on me now. The real threat to my garden hadn't come from honest creatures following their nature. It had come from someone I'd trusted, someone who'd learned exactly how to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that small towns reserve for their most serious gossip. "Margaret was on the phone with someone right after it happened. I could hear her through the window, and she was agitated about something. Kept saying, 'You went too far, and this wasn't what we discussed.' Could have been about anything, but the timing seems mighty convenient." The implications of what she was suggesting settled over me like a cold fog. Bad enough that Derek might have destroyed my garden in some misguided act of rebellion or jealousy, but if Aunt Margaret had been involved in planning it, if this had been a calculated family conspiracy rather than an impulsive act of vandalism, then everything I'd believed about my place in the family structure would need to be reevaluated. I thought about the past year, replaying conversations and interactions through this new lens of suspicion. How many of Margaret's seemingly innocent questions about my plans had actually been intelligence gathering? How many times had Derek's casual visits been opportunities to scout out my garden's layout and identify the most valuable targets? The motion sensor camera held the answers, but I found myself reluctant to retrieve the memory card. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be unknown. Some betrayals, once confirmed, permanently alter the landscape of family relationships. But as I stood there among the ruins of something I'd poured my heart into creating, I realized that the truth, however painful, was the only foundation upon which I could build whatever came next. The memory card felt heavier than its actual weight as I carried it into the house, as if it contained not just digital data, but the accumulated weight of family secrets and small-town politics. I set it on the kitchen table next to Grandma Rose's old recipe box and stared at it for nearly an hour, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold and trying to prepare myself for whatever truth lay encoded in those electronic files. My daily routine had become a refuge since moving back to Millbrook, a carefully constructed sequence of small rituals that provided structure in a life that had been thoroughly dismantled. Each morning at 5:30, I'd wake without an alarm, dress in yesterday's clothes, and walk through the garden with my first cup of coffee. I'd check each plant individually, looking for signs of growth, disease, or pest damage, making mental notes about watering schedules and harvest timing. Those morning inspections had been meditative, a way of connecting with something larger than my own circumstances. There's something profoundly hopeful about tending to growing things, about making daily investments in a future you can't quite see, but trust will arrive in its proper season. The garden had been my way of declaring that I believed in tomorrow, that despite the spectacular failure of my marriage and the professional setbacks that had followed, I still thought life held possibilities worth cultivating. Now that ritual lay in ruins, another casualty of whatever complex dynamic was playing out between Derek, Aunt Margaret, and me. The house itself had required months of work to make habitable. Grandma Rose had lived independently until she was 87, but the final years had been marked by a gradual retreat from maintenance and upkeep. The walls needed paint, the plumbing required updating, and the electrical system dated back to an era when houses contained 3 outlets total, and no one had imagined the possibility of wireless internet. But I tackled each repair project with the same methodical attention I brought to gardening, learning skills I'd never needed during my marriage to David, who'd handled all practical matters with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in a house where fathers taught sons to use tools and mothers managed the emotional labor. The divorce had required me to become entirely self-sufficient in ways that were both liberating and exhausting. Derek had offered to help with the renovations during my first month back in town, appearing at my door with a toolbox and an eagerness that had surprised me. The cousin I remembered from childhood had been more interested in video games and avoiding chores than in construction projects, but people change, and I'd assumed his willingness to work with his hands represented some kind of personal growth. We'd spent 3 weekends together, stripping wallpaper from the kitchen and replacing rotted boards on the front porch. Derek worked with the focused intensity of someone who needed to keep his hands busy, and our conversations during those shared projects had given me glimpses into the man he'd become since we'd lost regular contact. His marriage to Sarah had ended badly, he told me, while sanding down the porch railings. She wanted children and stability. He wanted adventure and freedom. The irony, he'd added with a bitter laugh, was that he'd ended up with neither children nor adventure, just a studio apartment above the laundromat and a series of jobs that barely covered his expenses. "Sometimes I think I'm cursed," he'd said during one of those working afternoons, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Like, everything I touch turns to garbage. Mom says it's because I don't try hard enough, but I feel like I'm trying all the time and just making things worse." I felt genuine sympathy for him then, remembering my own struggles with self-doubt during the aftermath of my divorce. The conversation had seemed to mark a new level of honesty in our adult relationship, cousin to cousin rather than the adult-to-child dynamic that had characterized our interactions when he was still a teenager and I was already married and living in Portland. But now, looking back through the lens of suspicion that recent events had created, I wondered if that apparent vulnerability had been calculated. Derek had always been intelligent, even as a child, smart enough to know that showing weakness could be a form of manipulation, that people's desire to help could be weaponized if you knew which emotional buttons to press. The phone rang, jarring me from my brooding reverie. Margaret's name appeared on the caller ID, and I found myself staring at the display for several rings before deciding to answer. "Maya, sweetie, I heard about your garden," she said, her voice carrying that particular combination of sympathy and satisfaction that had characterized her communication style for as long as I'd known her. "I'm so sorry about the storm damage. These weather patterns have been just terrible this year." There it was again, the insistence that weather had caused the destruction I'd discovered. But Margaret's tone contained an undertone I couldn't quite identify, something that suggested she was reading from a script rather than speaking spontaneously. "It wasn't storm damage, Aunt Margaret," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Someone deliberately destroyed my garden. Someone who knew exactly which plants were most valuable and which ones to leave alone."
The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the connection had been lost. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice had shifted into a different register, one I remembered from childhood confrontations with my mother. "That's a very serious accusation, Maya. I hope you're not planning to spread rumors without proof. This is a small town, and people's reputations matter." The warning was clear, wrapped in the velvet glove of family concern, but unmistakably a warning nonetheless. Don't push this. Don't ask uncomfortable questions. Accept the lie and move on. But I'd spent too many years accepting lies for the sake of keeping peace. My marriage had been built on a foundation of small deceptions and willful blindness, and I'd learned too late that some forms of peace are actually surrender disguised as harmony. "I have a security camera," I said simply. "It recorded everything that happened Tuesday night." This time, the silence was absolute, so complete that I could hear the clock ticking in Margaret's kitchen through the phone line. When she spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "I think you should be very careful about making assumptions, Maya. Sometimes things aren't what they appear to be. Sometimes family members need to stick together instead of looking for reasons to tear each other apart." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving me staring at a dead phone and feeling like I'd just crossed some invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. In the space of 5 minutes, Margaret had transformed from concerned aunt to something approaching an adversary, and the shift had been so complete that it left me questioning whether I'd ever really known her at all. I thought about the Christmas dinners and birthday parties, the graduation celebrations and wedding planning sessions where Margaret had played the role of devoted sister and aunt. How much of that warmth had been genuine and how much had been performance? How long had she been harboring whatever resentment or jealousy was now expressing itself through her son's destructive behavior? The recipe box drew my attention back to the kitchen table, its wooden surface worn smooth by decades of Grandma Rose's handling. Inside were hundreds of index cards covered in her careful script, recording not just ingredients and cooking instructions, but family stories and seasonal wisdom. I'd been meaning to organize them since moving back, but something had always prevented me from diving too deeply into that particular project. Now I pulled out a card at random, hoping for some kind of guidance or comfort from beyond. Margaret's Lemon Bars, 1987, read the heading, followed by a recipe that included detailed instructions for achieving the perfect balance of sweet and tart. But in the margin, in Grandma's distinctive handwriting, was a note that made me pause. Margaret always asks for this recipe, but never follows it exactly. Says she can improve on anything, results speak for themselves. It was a small thing, barely a criticism at all, but it revealed a dimension of family dynamics I'd never noticed as a child. Margaret's need to modify everything, to put her own stamp on whatever she encountered, even when the original worked perfectly well. Her inability to simply accept good things as they were without needing to control or change them. I found myself wondering if this tendency extended beyond baking, if Margaret's meddling nature had been expressing itself in other areas of family life, in ways too subtle for a child to notice, but clear enough for someone with adult perspective and access to Grandma's private thoughts. The afternoon wore on as I avoided the inevitable confrontation with the memory card. I reorganized the spice cabinet, cleaned windows that didn't need cleaning, and called 3 different hardware stores to price replacement plants. Each task was a form of procrastination, a way of delaying the moment when I'd have to see proof of whatever betrayal had been recorded by the motion sensor camera.
But evening was approaching, and with it the need to make decisions about how to proceed. The truth was waiting, patient and implacable as winter, and no amount of busy work would make it any less demanding of my attention. I made dinner from scratch, following one of Grandma Rose's recipes exactly as written, taking comfort in the precision of measurements and timing. Cooking had never been one of my particular talents, but there was something soothing about following instructions that had been tested by time and proven reliable. Unlike people, recipes didn't hide their true nature or harbor secret agendas. As I ate, I found myself thinking about Derek's childhood, trying to remember signs of the destructive tendencies that had apparently been gestating all these years. He'd been a complicated kid, alternately charming and moody, capable of surprising kindness, but also prone to sulking when things didn't go his way. His parents' marriage had been rocky even then, though the adults had tried to hide it from the children during family gatherings. I remembered one particular Christmas when Derek had been maybe 12 years old. He'd received a remote control helicopter as his main gift, something he'd been wanting for months. But when his cousin on the other side of the family had gotten a newer, more sophisticated model, Derek's joy had curdled into resentment so bitter that he'd accidentally crashed his own helicopter into a tree, rather than play with something that was suddenly inadequate by comparison. At the time, the adults had dismissed it as typical preteen behavior, the kind of emotional volatility that kids eventually grow out of. But what if Derek had never grown out of it? What if that 12-year-old's inability to enjoy what he had when someone else had something better had metastasized into an adult's willingness to destroy what he couldn't possess or control. The memory card seemed to pulse with malevolent energy from across the room, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give it. But the approaching darkness made further delay impossible. Whatever truth it contained would be revealed tonight, in the privacy of my grandmother's kitchen, with only the ghost of her wisdom for company. I cleared the dinner dishes with unusual care, as if preparing for a ceremony. Then I retrieved my laptop from the bedroom, inserted the memory card, and prepared to learn exactly what kind of family I'd been born into. The first few hours of footage revealed nothing more sinister than the nocturnal habits of neighborhood cats and the persistent optimism of moths drawn to the solar lights along my garden path. I fast-forwarded through long stretches of static imagery, watching the timestamp advance through the early evening hours while my computer's fan hummed with digital effort. But at 1:47 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the motion sensor triggered, and Derek's unmistakable silhouette appeared at the edge of the frame. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd planned this expedition in advance, carrying what appeared to be a small sledgehammer and wearing dark clothes that would have made him nearly invisible to anyone without night vision recording equipment. But the camera's infrared capability rendered his actions in stark black and white detail, creating a documentary record of systematic destruction that was almost artistic in its clarity. Derek didn't simply vandalize my garden. He curated his destruction with the precision of someone who understood exactly what would cause maximum emotional damage. I watched him pause at each plant, evaluating its significance before deciding whether it deserved annihilation. The heirloom tomatoes received his immediate attention, each plant torn from its stakes and thrown aside with theatrical violence. But he walked past the cherry tomatoes without a second glance, leaving them to bear witness to the devastation of their more valuable neighbors. The heritage rosebush required more effort. Derek struggled with its root system for nearly 10 minutes, using the sledgehammer to break apart the carefully constructed raised bed before attacking the plant itself. His face, when turned toward the camera, showed not anger, but something approaching satisfaction. The expression of someone finally able to express feelings that had been building for months or years. But the most disturbing part of the footage came when Derek paused in his destruction to make a phone call. He stood among the wreckage he had created, surrounded by uprooted plants and scattered soil, and had what appeared to be a lengthy conversation with someone who was apparently coaching him through the next phase of his attack.
The camera couldn't record audio, but Derek's body language suggested he was receiving instructions. He nodded repeatedly, gestured toward different sections of the garden, and at one point seemed to be taking notes on his phone. This wasn't a crime of passion or an impulsive act of vandalism. It was a coordinated assault, planned and supervised by someone with a clear agenda. When the call ended, Derek's approach changed. He became more methodical, moving through the garden with the systematic thoroughness of someone following a checklist. He targeted specific varieties of vegetables I'd mentioned during family dinners, demolished a trellis system I'd spent weeks constructing, and scattered the contents of my compost bin across the lawn with vindictive precision. The entire assault lasted 43 minutes, documented in excruciating detail by a device Derek himself had suggested I install. The irony was so complete, it felt like a plot twist from a particularly dark piece of fiction, except that the destroyed garden visible through my kitchen window provided undeniable evidence that this was devastatingly real. I saved the video files to multiple locations and made backup copies on 2 separate flash drives before calling Tom Kellerman. Despite the late hour, he answered on the second ring, sounding alert and concerned when I explained what I'd discovered. "You need to file a police report," he said immediately. "This isn't just family drama anymore, Maya. This is criminal destruction of property. And you have it all on video. Frank Morrison's been chief of police for 20 years, and he doesn't play favorites when it comes to crime, even when it involves prominent local families."
But I hesitated, knowing that involving law enforcement would escalate the situation beyond any possibility of private resolution. Small towns have long memories, and family feuds that become public record have a way of poisoning relationships for generations. My mother's exile from the family had begun with a similar escalation, when private grievances had been aired in forums that made reconciliation impossible. "Let me talk to them first," I said, though Tom's skeptical silence suggested he thought I was making a mistake. "Give them a chance to make this right before I involve the authorities." "Maya, honey," Tom said gently, "these people just committed a felony against you and tried to cover it up. They're not operating in good faith, and giving them advance warning about the video evidence might just give them time to prepare their defense or retaliate in other ways." His concern was valid, but I'd lived through enough family dysfunction to know that sometimes the nuclear option creates more fallout than the original problem. I promised to consider his advice, but privately, I was already planning a more direct approach. The next morning brought unseasonably cold weather, as if nature itself was responding to the emotional climate that had settled over my corner of Millbrook. I dressed carefully for what I knew would be a difficult conversation, choosing clothes that projected confidence without appearing confrontational. The video evidence was safely stored on a flash drive in my pocket, but I hoped I wouldn't need to use it. Margaret's house occupied the corner lot at the end of our street, a colonial revival that had always been the most impressive residence in the neighborhood. She and my uncle had bought it shortly after their wedding, when he was still working as a regional sales manager and she was teaching high school English. The house represented their aspirations during the optimistic early years of their marriage, before his drinking became problematic and her disappointments began to calcify into permanent resentment. Derek's truck was parked in the driveway, confirming that both conspirators were available for the conversation I'd been rehearsing during the sleepless hours after viewing the security footage. I knocked on the front door with more confidence than I felt, drawing strength from the knowledge that truth was on my side, even if family politics weren't. "Margaret, it's 8:30 in the morning. What's so important that it couldn't wait until a reasonable hour?" "I need to speak with you and Derek," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "It's about what really happened to my garden."
Her face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and finally a kind of defensive anger that confirmed my suspicions about her level of involvement. "Come in," she said curtly, stepping aside to let me enter. "But I hope you're not planning to make wild accusations without proof." The living room hadn't changed much since my childhood visits, still dominated by the overstuffed furniture and heavy draperies that Margaret favored. Family photographs covered every available surface, creating a shrine to better times when smiles had been genuine and holiday gatherings hadn't required careful navigation of emotional minefields. Derek emerged from the kitchen carrying a coffee mug and wearing the kind of studiously casual expression that suggested he'd been prepared for this confrontation. He'd changed out of the dark clothes visible in the security footage, but there were scratches on his hands that corresponded perfectly to the rosebush struggle I'd witnessed on video. "Morning, Maya," he said, settling into the recliner that had been his father's seat. "Mom said you had some kind of problem with your garden. Sorry to hear about the storm damage." The lie was delivered with such practiced smoothness that I almost admired his commitment to the deception. But the scratches on his hands were fresh, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he was enjoying this performance more than someone genuinely concerned about storm damage should. "There was no storm," I said simply. "Someone deliberately destroyed my garden, and I have video footage of exactly who did it and when." The silence that followed was profound enough that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and the distant hum of Margaret's refrigerator. Derek's face went through its own series of calculations while Margaret's mouth compressed into the thin line that had always signaled serious trouble during family gatherings. "That's a very serious accusation," Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury I remembered from childhood confrontations between her and my mother. "I hope you're prepared to back it up with evidence, because spreading false rumors about family members is a form of slander." I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. motion sensor camera with night vision capability, 43 minutes of high-definition footage showing Derek systematically destroying my garden while apparently receiving instructions over the phone from someone who knew exactly which plants to target. Derek's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly airless room. Coffee spread across the floor in a dark stain that looked almost like blood in the morning light filtering through Margaret's heavy curtains. "You can't prove that's me in the video," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's dark and anyone could have. I can see your face clearly when you turn toward the camera. I can see the scratches you got from fighting with the rose bush, the same scratches that are still visible on your hands right now. I can see your truck's license plate when you parked it on Maple Street, thinking you were being clever by not parking directly outside my house." Margaret stood abruptly, her robe billowing around her like battle armor. "Even if Derek did what you're claiming, and I'm not admitting anything, it would have been a momentary lapse of judgment. He's been under tremendous stress since the divorce, and sometimes people make mistakes when they're not thinking clearly." "This was not a mistake," I said, my voice harder than I had intended. "This was a coordinated attack. Derek spent almost an hour destroying only the most valuable and meaningful plants while leaving the common ones untouched. That requires knowledge, planning, and systematic thinking. And the phone call suggests that he wasn't working alone." Derek slumped in his chair like a punctured balloon, all the artificial bravado draining out of him. "Maya, But Margaret cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't say another word," she snapped at her son, before turning back to me. "What do you want? Money to replace your plants? An apology? Name your price for keeping this family business private."
The casual assumption that everything could be bought or negotiated away struck me as profoundly insulting. But it also revealed something important about how Margaret viewed relationships and accountability. In her world, problems were transactions to be managed, rather than genuine conflicts requiring authentic resolution. "I want to know why," I said. "I want to understand what I've done to deserve this kind of treatment from my own family. I want to know how long you've been planning this and whether there have been other incidents I'm not aware of." Derek looked up from his contemplation of the coffee stain, and for a moment I glimpsed the boy I'd once known, vulnerable and desperate for approval even as he engaged in destructive behavior. "It wasn't supposed to be that bad," he said quietly, ignoring his mother's furious glare. "It was just supposed to be a little damage, enough to make you consider moving somewhere else. But once I started, I couldn't stop myself." "Moving somewhere else?" I repeated, the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in my mind. "Why would you want me to move?" Margaret's face flushed red, but with anger rather than embarrassment. "Because you don't belong here," she said, the words erupting from her with surprising vehemence. "You had your chance to make a life somewhere else, and you failed. Now you come crawling back to play the grieving granddaughter and claim inheritance that should have stayed in the immediate family." The depth of resentment in her voice was breathtaking. Years or decades of accumulated jealousy and perceived injustice finally given voice. But her words also revealed the true motive behind the garden attack, and it wasn't Derek's emotional instability or the stress of his divorce. "Grandma Rose left me the house because she wanted to," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "She could have left it to you or Derek or anyone else in the family. Her will was her decision to make." "Her decision was influenced by your manipulation," Margaret shot back. "All those visits during her final years, all of that time you spent playing the devoted granddaughter while the rest of us were busy with our own lives. You calculated exactly how to position yourself as her favorite so you could inherit property that should have gone to her own children." The accusation was so far from reality that I almost laughed, except that Margaret's conviction was clearly absolute. In her mind, my genuine affection for Grandma Rose had been a long-term con game designed to steal family resources. The visits, the phone calls, the hours spent listening to old stories and family history, All of it had been reframed as manipulation rather than love. "That's not what happened," I said. But even as I spoke, I realized that Margaret would never accept any explanation that didn't support her version of events. Some grievances become so central to people's identity that they can't be resolved with facts or logic. Derek cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the charged atmosphere. "Mom, maybe we should just what?" Margaret whirled on him with fury that made me take a step backward. Should just admit that we're the bad guys in her little victim story? Should just hand over even more family assets to someone who already got more than she deserved? The conversation was spiraling beyond rational discourse, but it was also revealing layers of family dysfunction I'd never suspected. Margaret's resentment wasn't just about the inheritance or my return to Millbrook. It was about power dynamics that stretched back decades, about perceived slights and imagined conspiracies that had been festering in the dark corners of family relationships. I visited Grandma Rose because I loved her, though I knew the words would fall on deaf ears. The house was her gift to me, not something I manipulated her into leaving me. If you have a problem with her final wishes, you should have addressed it with her while she was alive. "Oh, we tried," Margaret said with a bitter laugh, "but she was already under your spell by then, already convinced that you were the only grandchild who really cared about her. You made sure the rest of us looked selfish and neglectful by comparison." I thought about the last 2 years of Grandma Rose's life, when her health had been declining and she'd needed increasing amounts of help with daily tasks. I'd driven down from Portland every other weekend, spending Saturdays grocery shopping and cleaning while listening to her stories about the family's earlier generations. Margaret had visited occasionally, but those visits had been brief and seemed to focus more on extracting information about inheritance plans than on providing companionship or assistance.
But in Margaret's version of events, my consistent presence had been strategic rather than loving, calculated to position myself as the heir apparent rather than simply being present for someone I cared about. The reframing was so complete that I wondered if she'd convinced herself it was true, or if she knew she was lying but found the lie more comfortable than the reality of her own choices. "There were other incidents," Derek said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Other times when I tried to encourage you to leave." Margaret shot him a look that could have melted steel, but he continued speaking as if the weight of secrecy had become unbearable. "The mailbox thing last month, that was me. I loosened the bolts so it would fall over during the next windstorm. And the garbage cans that kept getting knocked over, I was doing that too, trying to make it seem like maybe you were having problems with neighborhood kids or something." Each revelation felt like a physical blow, reshaping my understanding of the past several months. Incidents I'd attributed to coincidence or minor vandalism had actually been part of a systematic campaign designed to make me feel unwelcome in my own neighborhood. The psychological warfare had been subtle but persistent, death by 1,000 small frustrations rather than any single dramatic confrontation. "The sprinkler system that kept malfunctioning?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Derek nodded miserably. "I knew where Grandma kept the shutoff valve. It was easy to turn it partway closed so the water pressure would be inconsistent. I thought maybe if your garden started failing, you'd get discouraged and think about moving somewhere with better soil or something." The casual cruelty of it was stunning, but what struck me even more was the level of planning involved. Derek had been studying my routines, learning my vulnerabilities, and systematically exploiting them for months. This wasn't impulsive mischief. It was psychological warfare conducted by someone who'd once been one of my closest childhood companions. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" I asked, though the question felt naive even as I spoke it. "If you had concerns about the inheritance or my moving back to town, why not have an honest conversation instead of this elaborate campaign of harassment? Because you wouldn't have listened. Because people like you never do. You make your decisions and expect everyone else to just accept them,
regardless of how those decisions affect other people. People like me? I repeated, genuinely confused about what category I was supposed to represent. People who take what they want and dress it up as virtue. People who convince themselves they're entitled to special treatment because they've suffered some minor setbacks. Your divorce was unfortunate, Maya, but it doesn't give you the right to come back here and claim resources that could have helped Derek get back on his feet. The conversation had revealed the core of Margaret's grievance, but it had also exposed the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of her position. Derek's problems weren't caused by my inheriting Grandma Rose's house. They were caused by his own poor decisions and inability to take responsibility for the consequences. But it was easier to blame an external target than to confront the uncomfortable reality of personal accountability. Derek is 22 years old, I said, trying to inject some rationality into a discussion that had careened beyond reasonable bounds. He's old enough to make his own choices and deal with their consequences. Grandma's house wouldn't have solved his fundamental problems any more than destroying my garden will solve them.
"You don't know what it's like," Derek said, his voice thick with self-pity. "Everyone expecting you to have your life figured out. Everyone disappointed when you can't live up to their standards. At least when you failed, you had somewhere to go, something to fall back on. Some of us don't have that luxury." His words revealed the entitled thinking that had probably contributed to his current circumstances, but they also showed how deeply he'd internalized his mother's narrative about family resources and competing claims to support. In their shared mythology, my inheritance represented a theft of opportunities that should have been his, rather than the natural result of Grandma Rose's autonomous decision-making. "I worked for 15 years to build a life in Portland," I said, though I knew the facts wouldn't penetrate their defensive construction of reality. "I earned my own money, bought my own house, and when the marriage ended, I lost most of what I'd accumulated. Moving back here wasn't my first choice. It was the option available to me after other options had been exhausted." "But you had an option," Margaret said triumphantly, as if this proved her point. "You had a safety net that Derek doesn't have. Family property that cushioned your fall while he has to struggle without any help from anyone." The logic was so twisted that I felt dizzy trying to follow it. Margaret seemed to believe that Grandma Rose's bequest to me had somehow deprived Derek of assistance he was entitled to receive, despite the fact that Grandma had been under no obligation to provide for her adult grandchildren's financial security. But emotional reasoning rarely follows logical pathways, and Margaret's resentment had clearly been building for years without being challenged by inconvenient facts. The room felt smaller than when I'd entered it, as if the weight of accumulated secrets and resentments was physically compressing the available space. I could smell coffee from Derek's spilled mug, mixing with the lingering scent of Margaret's morning cigarette, and creating an atmosphere that seemed to capture the toxic nature of what was being revealed. "So what happens now?" I asked, though I knew the answer would be unsatisfying. "Do you expect me to sell the house and split the proceeds with Derek? Do you want me to move away and pretend this conversation never happened? What would constitute justice in your version of events?" Margaret and Derek exchanged a look that suggested they'd discussed the scenario in detail, probably during the phone call I'd witnessed on the security footage. The pause stretched long enough that I began to suspect they were waiting for me to make the first offer, treating this confrontation like a negotiation rather than a reckoning. "We want you to understand that actions have consequences," Margaret said finally. "We want you to recognize that your decisions affect other people, not just yourself. And we want you to consider whether staying in Millbrook is really in anyone's best interests." The threat was elegantly phrased, but unmistakable. Submit to their version of justice,
or face escalating harassment designed to make my life unbearable. It was extortion, dressed up as family concern. And the sophisticated nature of the manipulation made it more disturbing than crude threats would have been. But it also clarified my options in ways that mere uncertainty hadn't. Margaret and Derek had revealed themselves completely, removing any ambiguity about their intentions or their methods. Whatever happened next, I would be dealing with declared adversaries rather than family members operating in good faith. "I'm not leaving," I said. The decision crystallized as I spoke. Grandma Rose left me her house because she wanted me to have it, and I'm going to honor her gift by making a life here. If you want to continue this campaign of harassment, that's your choice, but I won't be intimidated into abandoning what's rightfully mine. Derek started to say something, but Margaret silenced him with another sharp gesture. Her face had hardened into an expression I'd never seen before, cold and calculating, in a way that made me understand why my mother had found it necessary to distance herself from this side of the family.
"You'll regret that decision," she said quietly. "This is a small town, Maya. People talk. Reputations matter. You might find that life here becomes more difficult than you anticipated." The threat was less veiled now, promising social warfare in addition to the physical harassment I'd already endured. But it also revealed the limits of Margaret's power. If she'd had more direct ways of forcing me to leave, she would have used them by now. The campaign of petty sabotage and psychological pressure suggested that her options were actually quite limited, despite her confident threats. I stood to leave, recognizing that further conversation would only provide opportunities for additional threats or ultimatums. The flash drive remained on the coffee table, its presence a reminder that truth had a way of persisting, even when people preferred comfortable lies. "I'll be filing a police report about the garden," I said, though I hadn't completely decided whether to follow through on the threat. Destruction of property is a crime, regardless of family relationships or claimed justifications. Margaret's mask of control slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked almost like panic. "Maya, you don't want to involve the authorities in family business. That never ends well for anyone." But I was already moving toward the door, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of resentment and manipulation that had infected what should have been a simple conversation between relatives. The morning air felt crisp and clean after the claustrophobic intensity of Margaret's living room, and I breathed deeply as I walked back toward my grandmother's house. Behind me, I could hear raised voices as Margaret and Derek began what sounded like a heated argument about tactics and consequences. Their coalition was apparently less stable than I had initially believed, held together by shared grievances rather than genuine cooperation. The discovery provided a small measure of strategic advantage, but it also suggested that whatever came next might be even more unpredictable than the systematic harassment I'd already endured. The war for my place in Millbrook had been formally declared, and the opening skirmishes had revealed the true nature of my opposition. But it had also clarified my own position and resolve in ways that months of uncertainty hadn't managed to accomplish. I was staying, and I was fighting back. Morrison nodded as if he'd expected that response. "Fair enough. We'll need formal statements from you, documentation of the property damage, and copies of this security footage. I'll also want to interview potential witnesses. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, mentioned seeing Derek's truck in the area." The process of filing criminal charges proved more emotionally exhausting than I'd anticipated. Reducing family betrayal to legal terminology and evidentiary requirements stripped away the personal dimensions that made the situation so painful. But it also provided a framework for moving forward that didn't depend on Margaret and Derek's willingness to acknowledge their behavior. Morrison assigned the case to Detective Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 40s who'd moved to Millbrook from the state capital after marrying a local attorney. Her outsider status meant she approached local family dynamics with professional detachment rather than the personal knowledge that might have compromised an investigation involving long-term residents. I've seen cases like this before, Chen told me during our initial interview. Small towns can be pressure cookers for family resentments, especially when property inheritance is involved. The good news is that your documentation is excellent. The bad news is that family cases tend to get complicated quickly once word gets around. Her prediction proved accurate within hours of Derek's arrest. Margaret had apparently spent the morning working her telephone network, crafting a narrative that portrayed Derek as the victim of my vindictive overreaction to minor family disagreements. By afternoon, I was receiving calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, each offering their own version of family history and their assessment of my moral obligations. Cousin Linda from Syracuse called to remind me that Derek had always been sensitive and that involving law enforcement was probably overkill for what amounted to boys being boys. Uncle Robert phoned from Florida to suggest that I was making mountains out of molehills and that family should stick together during difficult times. Even my mother's sister Janet, who lived clear across the country in Oregon, somehow felt qualified to offer long-distance judgment about my decision to press charges. The coordinated nature of the response suggested that Margaret had been busy recruiting allies and shaping perceptions, probably emphasizing Derek's emotional struggles while minimizing the calculated nature of his campaign against me. But the calls also revealed something interesting about family dynamics. Most of my relatives were eager to offer opinions about my situation without having bothered to learn the actual facts. "Did any of them ask to see the security footage?" Tom asked when I described the afternoon's phone calls. "Did anyone want to hear your side of the story before deciding you were in the wrong?" The answer was no, which suggested that Margaret's version of events had been crafted to appeal to existing biases about family loyalty and conflict resolution. The narrative she was promoting probably emphasized Derek's vulnerability while portraying my response as disproportionate, relying on people's tendency to avoid uncomfortable details when simpler explanations were available. But not everyone was willing to accept Margaret's framing of the situation. Mrs. Henderson made a point of stopping by that evening with a casserole and an update on neighborhood sentiment. "Most folks around here are on your side," she reported while settling into one of Grandma Rose's kitchen chairs. "We've all had to deal with family members who don't respect boundaries, and we understand the difference between minor disagreements and deliberate harassment." Her support was echoed by other longtime neighbors who'd witnessed Derek's suspicious behavior over the past several months. The mailbox incident had been observed by the Kowalskis across the street, who'd assumed it was weather-related until learning about the broader pattern of sabotage. The garbage can problem had been noted by several residents, though they'd attributed it to teenage mischief rather than adult malice. "What bothers people most," Mrs. Henderson continued, "is that Margaret is trying to make this about family loyalty when it's really about accountability. Derek is 22 years old, not 12. When adults commit crimes, they should face adult consequences."
The investigation moved quickly once Detective Chen began interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. Derek's cell phone records confirmed calls to and from Margaret's number during the timeframe visible in the security footage, supporting the conspiracy charges that would make both of them legally responsible for the garden destruction. Bank records showed that Margaret had recently made several large cash withdrawals, suggesting that Derek's campaign had been financially supported as well as strategically coordinated. But the most damaging revelation came from Derek himself, who apparently lacked the emotional fortitude for sustained deception under professional questioning. During his second interview with Detective Chen, he broke down and provided a detailed confession that implicated Margaret as the primary architect of the harassment campaign. He was crying by the end of it, Chen reported when she called with an update. Said his mother had been pressuring him for months to find ways to make me uncomfortable enough to leave town. The garden attack was supposed to be the final straw that convinced you Millbrook wasn't a safe place to live. Derek's confession revealed additional incidents I hadn't connected to their campaign. The mysteriously dead battery in my car 3 weeks earlier, the repeated wrong number calls that had been waking me in the middle of the night, and even the lost mail delivery that had caused me to miss several important deadlines. The scope of their harassment was broader and more sophisticated than I'd realized, suggesting a level of obsession that was genuinely disturbing. Margaret's not talking, Chen continued, but Derek's statement provides enough evidence to charge her as an accessory. He says she planned everything and he just carried out her instructions. Claims he felt like he didn't have any choice because she threatened to kick him out if he didn't help. The pathetic nature of Derek's defense made it clear that whatever sympathy I'd felt for his circumstances was probably misplaced. Rather than taking responsibility for his choices, he was attempting to portray himself as another victim of Margaret's manipulation, as if being financially dependent on his mother had somehow absolved him of moral agency. But Derek's weakness also provided strategic advantages. His willingness to cooperate with the investigation meant that Margaret's role would be fully documented, eliminating any possibility that she could escape consequences by claiming ignorance of her son's actions. The conspiracy charges would hold both of them accountable for the full scope of their campaign, regardless of who had physically carried out specific acts of sabotage. The court proceedings moved with surprising efficiency for a small-town legal system. Derek pleaded guilty to destruction of property and criminal mischief in exchange for a reduced sentence and mandatory anger management counseling. Margaret fought the charges initially, but her attorney apparently convinced her that Derek's detailed confession made a trial unwinnable. Judge Patricia Holbrook, who'd been presiding over Millbrook's municipal court for nearly 2 decades, expressed unusual frankness when reviewing the case during the sentencing hearing. "This court has seen many family disputes over the years," she said, addressing Margaret and Derek from the bench, "but few that demonstrate such calculated cruelty combined with such weak justification. The defendant's claim that inheritance disputes warranted this level of harassment is not only legally invalid, but morally reprehensible." Derek received 6 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a no-contact order that prohibited him from approaching my property or communicating with me directly. Margaret's sentence was harsher: 1 year of probation, a substantial fine, and court-ordered restitution for the documented damages to my garden and other property. But the legal consequences, while satisfying in terms of formal justice, couldn't address the deeper damage that had been revealed during the investigation. The family relationships that had already been strained were now completely severed, and the broader extended family had chosen sides in ways that would probably persist for years or decades. More significantly, Derek's confession had revealed the extent to which Margaret's resentment had been driving family dynamics for much longer than I had realized. References in his statement to years of planning and waiting for the right opportunity suggested that her campaign against me had begun long before my return to Millbrook, possibly even before Grandma Rose's death.
Detective Chen had uncovered evidence that Margaret had been monitoring my grandmother's condition and my visits during her final years, apparently building a case for undue influence that she'd planned to use in challenging the will. When probate had proceeded without contest, she'd shifted to a strategy of making my life difficult enough that I'd voluntarily surrender what she couldn't legally claim. She kept detailed notes, Chen reported during our final interview: phone logs, visit schedules, even transcripts of conversations she'd overheard between you and your grandmother. This wasn't impulsive jealousy. This was systematic surveillance followed by strategic retaliation. The discovery that my private moments with Grandma Rose had been monitored and analyzed felt like a violation that went beyond anything Derek had done to my garden. Those final conversations with my grandmother had been precious partly because they'd felt intimate and unguarded, free from the performative aspects that often characterize family interactions. Learning that Margaret had been listening and taking notes transformed those memories into something else entirely. But the investigation had also revealed unexpected sources of support within the community. Tom Kellerman had organized an informal network of neighbors who'd been quietly documenting suspicious activity around my property, creating a record that had proven invaluable to the legal case. Mrs. Henderson had reached out to other longtime residents who remembered Margaret's conflicts with my mother years earlier, establishing a pattern of behavior that helped explain current events. Most surprisingly, several people had approached Detective Chen independently to report their own experiences with Margaret's manipulation and gossip over the years. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been using information gathering and reputation management as weapons for much longer than just this recent campaign against me.
Small towns protect themselves, Mrs. Henderson explained when I expressed amazement at the level of community support I'd received. We've all learned to recognize troublemakers, and we've all developed ways of dealing with them. Margaret's been on our watch list for years. She just finally went far enough to give us legal grounds for action. The revelation that my neighbors had been quietly protective of me, even before I'd realized I needed protection, was both comforting and humbling. It suggested that Millbrook's social fabric was more resilient than I understood, capable of distinguishing between genuine community members and those who used family connections to justify destructive behavior. As the immediate crisis resolved through legal channels, I found myself facing a different kind of challenge: how to rebuild a life that had been thoroughly disrupted by people I'd trusted. The garden could be replanted, the property damage could be repaired, and the legal system had provided formal vindication. But the psychological impact of discovering that family members had been actively working against me for months or years would require a different kind of healing. The first tomato of the new growing season ripened on a Tuesday morning in late July, exactly 4 months after the destruction that had changed everything. I discovered it during my dawn inspection walk, a perfect sphere of deep red hanging heavy on the vine like a promise fulfilled. The plant was one of dozens I'd cultivated from seeds saved from the previous year's harvest, a generation removed from the heirloom varieties that Derek had destroyed, but carrying their genetic memory forward. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Gardens, like communities, have ways of regenerating after trauma, finding strength in roots that run deeper than surface damage. The new garden bore little resemblance to its predecessor, designed with security and resilience in mind rather than the naive optimism that had characterized my first attempt at homecoming. Motion sensor lights illuminated every corner, raised beds were constructed with materials that would resist casual vandalism, and the overall layout prioritized visibility from multiple angles. But the most significant change was invisible to casual observation. This garden had been created with help. Tom Kellerman had designed and installed an irrigation system that would keep plants healthy even during extended dry periods. Mrs. Henderson had contributed starts from her own successful varieties, along with detailed notes about optimal growing conditions based on decades of local experience. Even Judge Holbrook had stopped by one weekend, bringing soil amendments and offering advice about deer-resistant perennials.
Trauma can be an opportunity, she'd said while helping me position a new trellis system, if you're willing to accept that healing requires community rather than individual effort. Her words proved prophetic in ways that extended far beyond gardening. The investigation and trial had forced Millbrook to confront uncomfortable truths about how it handled family conflicts and community accountability. The revelation that Margaret's harassment campaign had gone unnoticed for months prompted discussions about neighbor responsibility and the difference between respecting privacy and enabling abuse. Detective Chen had been asked to present her findings to the city council, creating a public record of how sophisticated manipulation could operate within small-town social networks. Her presentation led to new policies for handling domestic disputes and updated training for police officers dealing with cases that involved prominent local families. The Peterson case showed us that family status doesn't exempt anyone from accountability. Council member Robert Steinberg explained during a community meeting 6 months after the trial. We've learned that protecting community members sometimes requires challenging community leaders, even when that makes people uncomfortable. The institutional changes were accompanied by personal transformations that rippled through multiple families. Derek's court-ordered anger management counseling had apparently been more effective than anyone anticipated, leading to broader therapy that addressed his underlying depression and addiction issues. He'd enrolled in a trade program at the community college and taken a part-time job at an automotive repair shop, creating structure and purpose that have been missing from his life for years. More significantly, he'd written me a letter 6 months after his sentencing, taking full responsibility for his actions and acknowledging the deliberate nature of the harm he'd caused. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, but it demonstrated a level of self-awareness that suggested genuine change rather than strategic image management.
I know I can't undo what I did to your garden, he'd written in careful script, but I want you to know that I understand now how wrong it was. My problems weren't caused by your inheritance, and trying to hurt you didn't solve anything. I hope someday I can prove that I've learned to be a better person. The letter had arrived during a particularly difficult week when legal bills and repair costs were straining my budget, and its tone of authentic remorse had surprised me. I'd shown it to Tom, who'd read it carefully before offering his assessment. "Sounds like someone who's done real work on himself," he'd said, folding the pages with care. "Question is whether you're ready to believe people can change, or whether some bridges get burned permanently." I thought about that question for weeks before responding to Derek's letter, with a brief note acknowledging his apology while making clear that any future relationship would need to be earned through consistent behavior over time. It felt like the right balance between openness and protection, recognizing the possibility of redemption without naively exposing myself to repeated betrayal. Margaret's path had been more complicated. She'd initially responded to her conviction with defiant anger, hiring an attorney to appeal her sentence and launching a whisper campaign about judicial bias and prosecutorial overreach. But the appeal had been denied, and her attempts to rally community support had largely backfired as more details about her behavior became public. The turning point had come when Margaret's own sister, my Aunt Carol from Denver, had flown in for what was apparently a family intervention. Carol had never been particularly close to our branch of the family, but Derek's confession had revealed enough disturbing details to convince her that Margaret needed professional help rather than enablers. She'd been living in a fantasy world for years, creating elaborate explanations for why her life hadn't worked out the way she'd planned, always finding external targets to blame for internal problems. The situation with you was just the latest episode in a pattern that goes back decades. Carol's intervention had led Margaret entering therapy and beginning medication for depression and anxiety disorders that had apparently been untreated for most of her adult life. The combination of professional treatment and enforced accountability had gradually produced what appeared to be genuine insight into her behavior patterns. Margaret's own letter had arrived nearly a year after Derek's, written in the careful language of someone who'd been coached in taking responsibility without making excuses. It acknowledged the systematic nature of her campaign against me, expressed regret for the damage she'd caused to family relationships, and offered to make additional financial restitution beyond what the court had required. "I know I can't undo the hurt I've caused," she'd written, "but I want you to know that I'm working to understand why I was so threatened by your success that I felt justified in trying to undermine it. My therapist says that my behavior toward you was really about my own feelings of inadequacy and failure, but that doesn't excuse the choices I made." Like Derek's letter, Margaret's communication hadn't asked for immediate forgiveness or restoration of relationship. Instead, it had focused on acknowledging harm and demonstrating changed thinking, leaving space for whatever healing might be possible without demanding it as a rate. The letters had forced me to grapple with complex questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of rebuilding trust after betrayal. My initial impulse had been to reject any attempt at reconciliation, maintaining the protective distance that legal proceedings had created. But conversations with Judge Holbrook, who'd seen many families navigate similar crises, had gradually convinced me that rigid positions sometimes prevented the very healing they were designed to protect. "Forgiveness isn't about them," she'd explained during one of our garden consultations. "It's about you deciding whether carrying anger serves your long-term interests. You can forgive people without trusting them, and you can maintain appropriate boundaries while still leaving room for the possibility that people can change." Her perspective had influenced my decision to respond to both letters with cautious openness rather than complete rejection. I'd acknowledged their apologies while making clear that rebuilding relationships would require consistent demonstration of changed behavior over extended periods. It felt like the right balance between wisdom and compassion, protecting myself while not completely closing doors that might someday be worth opening. The healing process had been facilitated by unexpected sources of community support that extended far beyond my immediate neighbors. The story of my harassment and legal victory had spread through regional gardening networks, attracting visitors and correspondents from across the state who wanted to share their own experiences with family conflicts and property disputes. A particularly meaningful connection had developed with Sarah Martinez, a woman from the state capital who'd faced similar challenges when inheriting her grandmother's farm. She'd driven down to Millbrook for what was supposed to be a brief consultation about security systems, but had ended up staying for the weekend, helping me design new planting schemes while sharing stories about her own struggles with resistant family members. The hardest part, she'd said while we worked together to install deer fencing, was accepting that some people will never support your success, no matter how reasonable your position or how generous your offers of compromise. Once you stop trying to convince them and start protecting yourself instead, everything becomes clearer. Sarah's friendship had led to connections with other women who'd navigated similar challenges, creating an informal network of mutual support that extended across county lines. We'd begun meeting quarterly for garden tours and potluck dinners, sharing practical advice about everything from soil management to legal strategies for dealing with property disputes. The network had also generated opportunities I'd never anticipated. My experience with security systems and documentation techniques had led to invitations to speak at gardening conferences about protecting vulnerable plants and equipment. The presentations had been well received, leading to consulting opportunities that supplemented my income while allowing me to help other people avoid the kind of systematic destruction I had endured.
More ambitiously, I'd begun writing about the experience for gardening magazines, crafting articles that used my story to explore broader themes about community, resilience, and the healing power of growing things. The writing had been therapeutic as well as professionally rewarding, providing a way to transform trauma into something useful for other people facing similar challenges. The first published article had appeared in a regional magazine 6 months after the trial, generating enough reader response to convince editors that there was appetite for more content about the intersection of gardening and family dynamics. Subsequent pieces had explored topics like inheritance planning for family property, creating legal documentation for valuable plant collections, and building support networks for isolated gardeners. The writing had also led to an unexpected invitation to teach a workshop series at the community college, focusing on sustainable gardening techniques for beginning growers. The classes had been oversubscribed from the first semester, attracting students ranging from recent retirees to young families interested in growing their own food. "You've become something of a local celebrity," Tom had observed, while helping me prepare for my 3rd semester of teaching. "People respect what you've been through, but more than that, they respect how you've handled it. You've shown that it's possible to fight back against bullies without becoming one yourself." The classes had created opportunities to mentor individual students who faced their own challenges with family property or community acceptance. Several had been dealing with inheritance disputes similar to mine, while others had encountered resistance from neighbors or family members who disapproved of their gardening ambitions for various reasons. Working with these students had reinforced my understanding that the problems I'd faced weren't unique to my particular family dynamics. Small communities everywhere struggled with questions about who belonged, who deserved support, and how to balance individual rights with collective harmony. My experience had provided a template for addressing these challenges through legal means when necessary, but also through community building and mutual aid when possible. The teaching had also reconnected me with aspects of Grandma Rose's legacy that went beyond the house and property she'd left me. Many of my students were interested in heritage varieties and traditional growing techniques,
leading me to research my grandmother's own gardening practices and the networks of seed savers and plant traders she'd participated in during her lifetime. The research had revealed that Grandma Rose had been part of a regional network of gardeners who preserved rare varieties and shared them with other growers interested in maintaining genetic diversity. Her detailed journals, discovered in the attic during a recent cleaning project, documented decades of careful observation and experimentation with crops that were no longer commercially available. The journals revealed that Grandma Rose had been quietly maintaining one of the most significant collections of heirloom seeds in the region, carefully selecting and preserving varieties that commercial agriculture had abandoned in favor of uniform, high-yield crops. Her notes described flavor profiles, growing conditions, and harvest timing for dozens of tomato varieties, each entry written in the precise handwriting I remembered from birthday cards and recipe instructions. But more importantly, the journals revealed that she'd been planning to pass this knowledge on to me long before her final illness made inheritance decisions urgent. References dating back 5 years mentioned Maya's interest in growing things and teaching the next generation about real food. The documentation made it clear that her decision to leave me the house hadn't been influenced by my visits during her final years, as Margaret had claimed, but had been part of a longer-term plan to ensure that her life's work would continue. "She was training you without you realizing it," Mrs. Henderson observed while helping me prepare for my 3rd semester of teaching. "People respect what you've been through, but more than that, they respect how you've handled it. You've shown that it's possible to fight back against bullies without becoming one yourself." The revelation reframed everything I'd understood about my relationship with Grandma Rose and my place in the family's agricultural legacy. I hadn't inherited just property. I'd inherited responsibility for preserving genetic diversity and traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to development pressure and changing economic priorities. Acting on this understanding, I'd reached out to the regional seed preservation network that Grandma Rose had participated in, introducing myself as her successor and offering to continue her work. The response had been immediate and enthusiastic, with veteran gardeners eager to share their knowledge with someone who'd been personally trained by one of their most respected members. The connections had led to my most ambitious project yet: converting part of Grandma Rose's property into a demonstration garden focused on heritage varieties and sustainable growing techniques. The project required significant investment and planning, but grants from agricultural preservation organizations had provided initial funding, while volunteer labor from network members had made the physical construction possible. The demonstration garden had opened to the public the previous spring, attracting visitors from across the state who wanted to see heritage varieties in action and learn about traditional growing methods. School groups had begun including it in their agricultural education programs, while master gardener classes used it as a teaching site for advanced horticulture techniques. But the most meaningful aspect of the project had been its role in healing community relationships that had been damaged by the harassment campaign and its aftermath. Working together on a shared goal had provided opportunities for people to interact with me based on present contributions rather than past conflicts, gradually rebuilding trust that legal proceedings alone couldn't have restored. Even some of Margaret's former allies had approached me with offers to help, apparently recognizing that the demonstration garden represented something valuable for the entire community rather than just personal vindication for my family disputes. Their participation had been cautious initially, but consistent positive experiences had gradually overcome whatever lingering resentment they might have harbored about the trial and its outcomes. The project had also created opportunities for Derek to demonstrate the behavioral changes he'd claimed in his letter. He'd approached Tom Kellerman about volunteering for construction work, apparently understanding that any direct contact with me would be inappropriate given the no-contact order, but hoping to contribute to something positive in the community. Tom had brought me Derek's offer, along with his own assessment of the young man's apparent transformation.
He's been working steady for 8 months now, Tom had reported, and he's shown up on time every day, done good work, and hasn't caused any problems with other employees. Still has some growing up to do, but he seems like he's genuinely trying to change. After careful consideration, I'd agreed to allow Derek to work on the project under Tom's supervision, with the understanding that any problems would result in immediate removal from the work site. The arrangement had proceeded without incident, with Derek demonstrating the kind of reliability and attention to detail that had been missing from his character during the harassment campaign. More significantly, Derek's work had been observed by other community members who'd been following his progress since the trial. Several had offered him additional employment opportunities, recognizing that people who demonstrate genuine change deserve chances to rebuild their lives. By the end of the summer, he'd been offered a full-time position with benefits, providing the stability he'd been lacking for years. The progress hadn't been without setbacks. Derek had struggled with depression during the winter months, apparently finding it difficult to maintain motivation when seasonal work slowed down and social opportunities were limited. But he'd continued attending therapy and had joined a support group for people dealing with family addiction issues, creating a network of accountability that extended beyond professional counseling. Margaret's journey had been more complicated, marked by periods of apparent progress, followed by relapses into old patterns of thinking and behavior. Her therapy had revealed deep-seated issues related to childhood trauma and parental expectations that had shaped her approach to relationships and competition throughout her adult life.
The most significant breakthrough had come when Margaret's therapist had helped her understand that her resentment toward me had really been displaced anger about her own perceived failures and lost opportunities. The insight had led to broader work on self-acceptance and realistic goal setting that gradually reduced her need to blame external factors for internal dissatisfaction. Margaret had approached me directly for the first time since the trial on a cold February afternoon, appearing at my door with obvious nervousness and asking if we could talk. The conversation had been awkward initially, both of us struggling to find appropriate language for a situation that had no clear precedent in either of our experiences. "I've been thinking about what I put you through," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I finally understand that it wasn't really about you at all. I was so angry about my own life that I needed someone to blame, and you became the target because you represented everything I thought I should have had." The admission had been more honest than anything I'd expected from Margaret, but it had also raised complex questions about how to respond to someone who'd caused significant damage while operating under psychological pressure she hadn't fully understood. Forgiveness felt premature, but complete rejection seemed unnecessarily harsh given her apparent efforts to change. We'd settled on a cautious détente, agreeing to limited contact focused on family business that required coordination, but avoiding social situations that might create opportunities for renewed conflict. The arrangement felt sustainable without being particularly warm, acknowledging changed circumstances while maintaining appropriate protective boundaries. The approach had been tested 6 months later when Margaret had approached me about contributing financially to the demonstration garden project. Her offer had been substantial enough to fund additional infrastructure improvements, but accepting it would have created complications about her role in something I'd designed as a memorial to Grandma Rose's legacy. After extensive consultation with trusted advisors, I'd agreed to accept her contribution with the understanding that it would be acknowledged publicly but wouldn't create ongoing decision-making authority for her in project management. The arrangement had worked smoothly, with Margaret fulfilling her commitment while respecting the boundaries we'd established. More surprisingly, Margaret had begun attending some of the educational events at the demonstration garden, participating as a regular community member rather than seeking special recognition for her financial support. Her presence had been uncomfortable initially, but her behavior had been consistently appropriate, suggesting that whatever personal work she'd been doing was producing genuine results. The test of our family's healing had come during the second anniversary of the garden destruction, when Derek had asked through intermediaries whether he could visit the demonstration site to see what had grown from the aftermath of his destructive actions. The request had been phrased carefully, acknowledging wrongdoing while expressing genuine curiosity about positive outcomes. I'd agreed to the visit with conditions. Derek would come during regular public hours, would not seek private conversation with me, and would leave immediately if his presence created discomfort for other visitors. He'd accepted the terms without negotiation, appearing on a quiet Thursday afternoon when few other people were present. Watching Derek walk through the demonstration garden had been surreal. Seeing him observe the thriving plants that had grown in soil enriched by compost made from the destroyed heritage varieties he'd torn apart 2 years ago. His expression had been thoughtful rather than emotional, suggesting someone processing complex feelings about responsibility and redemption rather than seeking dramatic reconciliation. He'd spent nearly an hour examining different sections of the garden, reading the educational signs that explained heritage preservation techniques and sustainable growing methods. When he'd finally approached me, his words had been simple but apparently sincere. "Thank you for letting me see this," he'd said, gesturing toward the thriving plots around us. "I know I don't have any right to ask, but I'm glad something good came from what I destroyed. Maybe someday I can contribute something positive instead of just taking things away."
Been consistently respectful, and his focus had been on understanding consequences rather than seeking forgiveness he hadn't yet earned. The visit had also been observed by several community members who'd been monitoring Derek's progress since his conviction. Their positive assessment of his behavior had contributed to a gradual softening of local attitudes toward him, creating opportunities for broader social reintegration that extended beyond employment and legal compliance. By the 3rd anniversary of the garden destruction, the demonstration site had attracted national attention from agricultural preservation organizations impressed by its combination of education, community healing, and genetic conservation. I'd been invited to present at conferences in 3 different states, sharing the story of how trauma could be transformed into something beneficial for entire communities. The presentations had led to additional opportunities, including a book contract to document the complete story of the harassment campaign, legal response, and community healing process. The project would combine practical advice about dealing with family property disputes with broader reflections on resilience, forgiveness, and the role of growing things in processing difficult emotions. Research for the book had revealed that my experience wasn't unusual in rural communities where property inheritance and family dynamics intersected with economic pressure and changing social expectations. Similar conflicts were playing out across the country, often with less positive outcomes because people lacked access to legal resources or community support networks. The book would include chapters on practical security measures for valuable property, documentation techniques for harassment cases, and strategies for building community alliances that could provide protection when family relationships became adversarial. But it would also explore deeper questions about redemption, accountability, and the possibility of healing after betrayal. Writing about the experience had required me to revisit painful memories while also acknowledging positive changes that had emerged from a crisis. The process had been emotionally challenging, but ultimately clarifying, helping me understand how trauma could become a source of wisdom rather than just damage to be survived. The book project had also created opportunities to interview other people who'd faced similar challenges, documenting their strategies and outcomes in ways that might help future victims of family harassment. Their stories had revealed common patterns of manipulation and intimidation, but also effective responses that could be replicated by others facing comparable situations. One of the most important insights had come from a woman in Vermont who'd faced a harassment campaign from relatives who disputed her inheritance of family farmland. Her experience had taught her that legal victories were only the beginning of a longer healing process that required ongoing attention to relationship boundaries and community building. The court can stop the behavior, she'd explained during our interview, but it can't heal the underlying damage or prevent future problems.
That requires different kinds of work that most people aren't prepared for when they're just trying to survive the immediate crisis. Her observation had influenced my approach to both the book project and the ongoing management of my own family relationships. Legal accountability had been necessary, but not sufficient for creating the kind of long-term stability that would allow me to truly feel secure in Millbrook. The deeper work had involved rebuilding my sense of belonging in a community where some people had participated in undermining me, while others had quietly provided protection. Learning to trust again after betrayal had required careful attention to people's actions over time, rather than their immediate expressions of support or remorse. But the effort had been worthwhile, creating a foundation for community involvement that extended far beyond the demonstration garden. I'd been elected to the library board, joined the volunteer fire department auxiliary, and begun serving on a regional planning committee focused on agricultural preservation and rural economic development.
Each role had provided opportunities to contribute to community well-being, while also building relationships based on shared goals, rather than family history or past conflicts. The work had been satisfying in ways that purely personal healing couldn't have achieved, connecting me to something larger than my own recovery from harassment. The most meaningful recognition had come when the town council had voted to designate my demonstration garden as an official community resource, providing modest, ongoing funding for maintenance and educational programming. The designation represented public acknowledgement that the project had grown beyond personal vindication to become something valuable for everyone. Judge Holbrook had attended the ceremony where the designation was announced, offering remarks that placed my experience in broader context about community resilience and individual courage. Maya Peterson's response to systematic harassment demonstrates that trauma can be transformed into community asset when people are willing to do the hard work of healing while also demanding accountability, she'd said. Her garden stands as proof that destruction doesn't have to be permanent, and that communities can grow stronger when they support members who refuse to be silenced by intimidation. The judge's words had captured something important about what the experience had taught me. Recovery from betrayal required both personal growth and community engagement, both individual healing and systemic change. Neither approach alone would have been sufficient for creating the kind of long-term security and satisfaction I'd ultimately achieved. As I stood in the demonstration garden on the 4th anniversary of the destruction that had started everything, watching visitors learn about heritage varieties while children played among the raised beds, I felt something approaching gratitude for the difficult journey that had led to this moment. Derek and Margaret had caused real damage that couldn't be minimized or forgotten. But their actions had also created opportunities for growth, connection, and contribution that might never have emerged under easier circumstances. The garden around me was more beautiful and meaningful than anything I could have created without having first experienced loss. The motion sensor camera that had documented Derek's systematic destruction still occupied its position among the climbing roses, now serving as a symbol of vigilance rather than active surveillance. Its presence reminded visitors that beauty requires protection, but also that communities can provide that protection when individuals have the courage to seek help and demand accountability. Mrs. Henderson approached from the herb section, carrying a basket of lavender and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd been proven right about community resilience. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said, gesturing toward the thriving plots around us. "She always believed that good things could grow from difficult soil if someone was willing to tend them properly."
Her words carried the weight of 4 years of shared struggle and recovery, representing the kind of wisdom that only emerges from surviving genuine crisis. The garden around us stood as proof that healing was possible, but also that it required ongoing attention, community support, and the willingness to transform pain into something useful for others. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the demonstration beds, highlighting the careful arrangement of plants that had been selected for both beauty and genetic preservation. Heritage tomatoes hung heavy on sturdy vines, their diverse colors and shapes representing generations of careful selection by gardeners who understood that variety itself was a form of wealth. As visitors began preparing to leave for the day, I walked through the garden one final time, checking irrigation systems and making mental notes about harvest timing. The routine had become a meditation, a way of connecting with something larger than my own circumstances, while also honoring the legacy I'd inherited from Grandma Rose. The motion sensor light flickered on as darkness approached, illuminating the space where destruction had once reigned, but where new growth now flourished. The garden would continue its work through the night, quietly transforming sunlight and soil into nourishment, proving
Some forms of wealth could only be created through patience, care, and the willingness to believe in tomorrow's possibilities. In the distance, I could see lights beginning to come on in houses throughout Millbrook, marking the end of another day in a community that had learned to protect its members while also holding them accountable. The balance wasn't perfect, and probably never would be, but it was strong enough to support the kind of life I'd chosen to build here. Derek's truck passed slowly on the street beyond the garden fence, its driver visible in silhouette as he headed home from work. The sight no longer triggered anxiety or anger, but rather a complex mixture of sadness and hope that people could change if they were willing to do the necessary work. Margaret's porch light was already on at her house around the corner, where she continued her own journey of healing and accountability. Our relationship remained carefully limited, but no longer carried the toxic weight of unresolved resentment and mutual suspicion. The demonstration garden stood as proof that communities could heal from internal conflict when people were willing to demand justice while also leaving room for redemption. The process hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been thorough enough to create genuine transformation rather than just temporary peace. As I locked the garden gate and headed home to Grandma Rose's house, I carried with me the satisfaction of work well done and the quiet confidence that comes from surviving betrayal without becoming bitter. The motion sensor camera would stand guard through the night, but its vigilance now felt protective rather than fearful. Tomorrow would bring new visitors to the garden, new students to teach, and new opportunities to share the lessons I'd learned about resilience, community, and the healing power of growing things. The story that had begun with destruction had become one of renewal, proof that even the deepest betrayals could be transformed into something useful for others. The house that had once felt like a refuge from failure now felt like a base for meaningful work. The garden that had once been a private sanctuary had become a community resource, and the family relationships that had once seemed beyond repair had found a new equilibrium based on accountability, boundaries, and the hard-won wisdom that some forms of love require distance to remain healthy. As I settled into bed that night, I could see the garden's security lights through my window, steady and reassuring in the darkness. The motion sensor camera was ready to document whatever came next, but I no longer expected it to record anything more dramatic than the nocturnal habits of honest creatures following their nature. The real security came not from surveillance equipment, but from the community of people who'd chosen to stand with me when standing was difficult. That network would continue to provide protection and support long after legal orders expired and electronic devices became obsolete. In the morning, I would wake to tend the garden that had grown from destruction,
to teach students who wanted to learn traditional skills, and to continue the work of preserving something valuable for future generations. The motion sensor camera had revealed the truth about betrayal, but the deeper truth about healing had been revealed through years of patient work and community building. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or miraculous reconciliations. Mine had ended with the quieter satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships that could be trusted, and the knowledge that good things could indeed grow from difficult soil when someone was willing to tend them properly. The garden would be there in the morning, transformed by another night of quiet growth, ready for whatever new challenges and opportunities the next day might bring.